Peace be with you. I'm Pastor Stephen Gjerde at Zion and Bethany Lutheran Churches, and this is the Bible study for Sunday, March 16th. Sunday, May 16th, we are in Mark chapter 13. Pastor Johnson started Mark chapter 13 with you last week, and as he started to explain to you at that time, Mark 13 foretells what is to come. And for that reason, many people have questioned the authenticity of Mark 13 as a saying of Jesus. They do so from the perspective that Jesus could not possibly know the future. And since Jesus could not know the future, therefore, he could not, this Mark 13 could not be an original saying of his because he couldn't have guessed what was going to happen to Jerusalem. And this is so accurate in describing what would happen to Jerusalem that therefore it cannot be true. Of course, the underlying assumption of that view is that Jesus couldn't predict the future or know the future. Well, that's a statement of faith. That's a statement of an absence of faith in Jesus Christ and a faith in the world only as the eye sees it and the ear hears it. But of course, in the Christian church, we have good reason to believe otherwise. And that's the one important thing to remember. People will sometimes describe faith as a belief that has no evidence. But that is not the case. Paul calls hope or faith, trust in things unseen, hope in things unseen. And it's one thing to hope in something that's unseen. It's another thing to hope in something without evidence. We have evidence and we have reason for the faith that we hold in the Christian church. We have very good reasons to hold the faith that we hold. One man who explores this really well is C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. There's others who probably do it better, but he does it in a very accessible way that remains very relevant for folks today. Mere Christianity is the name of this very slender volume. It's a good read. It's something I encourage young people at the end of their high school years to read, perhaps earlier or later during college. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, a man who was once an atheist and then converted to a very devout defense of the Christian faith. We have reasons for believing what we believe. We have the witness of the apostles. We have the life of the early church. We have certain events in the piety of Jews in the early first century and mid to late first century that are only explainable if not only A, they believe Jesus is risen from the dead, but B, if they believed it because it really happened. Why would they suffer all things for the sake of something like the resurrection of Jesus, which brought them no particular empire or wealth, but that actually brought them great suffering? Why would they insist on believing in it? And the most reasonable explanation is that it really happened and they saw him risen from the dead. And so we have reasons for believing what we believe and more besides that. But that's one thing to remember as people bring up these kind of objections to things like Mark chapter 13. Now, another thing that Pastor Johnson was sharing with you, I believe, was how Mark 13 extends from the conviction that a new Jerusalem will be raised up in Jesus. There's the city of Jerusalem where God had his temple built, but now in Jesus, in the body of Jesus, the true temple has come because it is in the flesh, the body and blood of Christ, that we encounter God himself. He's speaking of his body when he speaks of the temple. And since that temple, that body of Christ is at the center of the church becomes the new Jerusalem, the new Israel. In particular, the church triumphant, delivered from sin, death, and the devil at the end of time. And since that is the case, God no longer requires the existence of a temple on earth for himself to be worshipped. He does not have to be worshipped in a particular place, but in spirit and truth. That is, in the word of Christ, which bears the Holy Spirit. So through the word of Christ and through the preaching of his gospel, a new creation is being unveiled, and as people come to faith, a new city is gathering its citizens across the world. Thanks be to God. So Mark 13 has that sort of as some of its background, And then it goes on to describe the destruction of Jerusalem, but it does so in a way that foreshadows also the end of the world. So sometimes when we study the prophets in the Old Testament, I will tell folks there's currents and there's undercurrents. There's the current that you see, the words that you see, and those currents run within a certain place and time that makes sense for that place and time. Then there's the undercurrent you don't see necessarily right away, in which this prophecy is actually about Christ, about the church, even though it's written, maybe 700 years before the birth of Christ or 500 years before the birth of Christ. It is about Christ and about his ministry, his death and resurrection, and the creation of the church, the unveiling of the new creation. And so, since in prophets, generally speaking, there are currents and undercurrents, so also are there in this chapter 13. And so the current is the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem, which would come to pass in 70 AD. But the undercurrent is the sufferings of the end of the world and the coming of Christ. The one points to the other. So 70 AD is about almost 40 years after when Christ is speaking here. In 70 AD, Romans would come up against Jerusalem because Jerusalem was part of the Roman Empire at that time. Jerusalem rebelled, or some people in Jerusalem rebelled and gained the sway of the city. And so the Roman Empire sent its armies against Jerusalem. And this really extended from the middle 60s through 70 AD. But it's in 70 AD that the city was reduced to rubble, including the temple. One interesting story, which will be relevant for what we're about to read, is that there was a man living in Jerusalem who wanted to present himself as the Messiah or the Christ in 70 AD. And in order to try to rally a following and to sort of rally the city over against the Romans, one thing that he did, according to historical witnesses, is he buried himself in the rubble of the temple. And then he popped up and said, "I am risen." He pretended to have been destroyed in the falling of the temple, and then came out of the rubble and presented himself as being risen from the dead in order to demonstrate that he is the Messiah. The reason why that's an interesting story is because it shows the extent to which the resurrection was understood to be an indicator of who the true Messiah is, and that by 70 AD, at least one man could believe that most of Jerusalem would understand that if he were risen from the dead, that would be the indication of him being the Messiah, which gives us a sense of the extent to which the gospel was known in Jerusalem, also to the extent to which the gospel indeed is fulfilling expectations that were at work in Jerusalem. But the other reason why it's interesting is because it gives us also a sense of the great devotion and expectation the people had for the coming of the Messiah in Jerusalem, that a man thought that by pretending to be the Messiah, he could gather this following, he could gather the sway of the city again by presenting himself as a Messiah. In a rather foolish way, of course, but thought he could do it in this way. And so that just shows the fervor for which people were waiting for the Messiah, and to what extent that was indeed the milieu, the situation in which people were operating them, which then helps us understand when Christ in today's text warns against false Christs. It actually was a real concern that people would pretend to be the Christ, and it still is in different ways. So let's jump into Mark chapter 13, beginning with verse 14. This is Jesus speaking. And he says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, Look, here is the Christ, or Look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard, I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Just something to me that is, the words of God are always powerful because of what they say and their power to create faith. There's something in those words that one really hears Jesus speaking from the future there. We hear him speaking from the future into the present. What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. I am on my way, and you do not know the hour or the day, the time or the hour. Okay, so let's begin with verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And then what follows after that is verses 15 through 18, where Jesus essentially says, go very quickly because it's going to be bad. Don't stick around and wait. As soon as you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to stand, get out of town. So what is this abomination of desolation? So that is a phrase that harkens back to a time that is not recorded in the Old and New Testaments as we have them, but that is referenced in the apocryphal writings, specifically in the apocryphal writings of Maccabees. So after, you may recall, just to give a brief history of Israel, Israel is slaves in Egypt, right? And this is around, there's always debates about this. So you read one thing, you read another, it says it's another. But if Israel is brought out of Egypt by Moses, around 2500 BC, give or take. And David then becomes king of Israel after this time of the time of wandering, the time of the judges. If Israel has as its king David around 1000 BC, and then Israel is sent into exile after the northern kingdom being, it's after David, Israel splits up into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is carried off, or not really carried off in the same way, but they're reduced to destitution around 720 BC by Assyria, and then around 586 BC, the southern kingdom is carried away by the empire of Babylon, and then around 525 BC, they all are allowed to come back when Persia takes over Babylon. And then thereafter, they start rebuilding the temple. Well, after that time, that's kind of where the Old Testament ends, is around the time of the return to Jerusalem, up to 500 BC. Christ is born around 1 BC, probably a little bit early, or 1 AD, probably a little bit earlier, 2 or 3 BC. In between that time, what happens to Jerusalem is that the Greeks, different petty kings, small kings from the Greek nation, ruled places like Egypt and the Near East. And there was one in particular that took over Jerusalem. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, I believe was his name. And what he said was that, or what he did was he came into Jerusalem where this temple had been rebuilt. It was in the process of being rebuilt. And he actually did the most horrific thing. He, a Gentile, a non-Jew, in order specifically to oppress, dominate, and humiliate the Jews, took a pig into the inner court of the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple, when in fact, I believe he had its blood sprinkled around the inside of the altar as well, inside of the temple, which, remember, not only are Jews only supposed to sacrifice what God says, sheep, rams, pigeons, some other animals. They are not even to eat pig. So he brings in a sacrifice God has not commanded, specifically an unclean food that Jews are not supposed to eat. And with that, he desecrates the temple. And this is referred to as the Abomination of Desolation. So what Jesus is doing is he is hearkening back to that time. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to stand, and again, this is in verse 14, he is saying that the time is coming again when a Gentile will stand where he ought not stand, namely in the temple, on the Temple Mount. Now, Jesus is not, by saying that, having us all buy back into the Old Testament rules of sacrifice and distinction of people and meats, but he is saying, he is calling to mind a very clear historical event in their mind, and saying, when you see that happen again, because he knows they'll know that, he's using a cultural reference that they all have. When you see that again, when the Romans are coming and the Romans are entering the temple, get out of town. Just get out of there. And so don't take your cloak. Go to the hills. Pray that it's not in winter, because you're going to be out in the elements. And blessed are the women who are not nursing at those days, because of course it's easier to run without a little child, and also easier to feed older children than a little baby who needs to have milk. In order to have milk, you need yourself to be a well-nourished person, doubly nourished, right? And there's going to be a lack of nourishment, there may be famine, etc., because famine often follows upon war, especially in the ancient world, or developing nations today as well. So just get out of town. And actually, this is what did happen. The Christians, I once asked my history professor in college, his name was Gottfried Crodel, and I said, what happened to the early Christians living in Jerusalem at the time of the desecration and destruction of the temple in 70 AD? And he said, well, it's a sad story, actually. They did flee Jerusalem, a majority of them, and they went down to the Sinai Peninsula. And their descendants actually became syncretists. What we mean by that is they started syncretizing the Christian religion with pagan religions in that area, and a lot of them became like sun worshipers. So it's kind of a sad story. And he said, and then eventually they were just conquered by Islam later, many centuries later. But they did do what Jesus says in the generation. They fled Jerusalem. They got out of town. And then he goes on to say, for in those days there will be such tribulation as not been seen from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And because there's always atrocities that attend war, the Romans were really good at using atrocity to make psychological warfare against their enemies. And so you've maybe heard of how they lined the Appian Way with, crucified rebels at one time, all like miles of people crucified on every side of the road leading into Rome, as a way of saying, here's what happens if you don't obey the law of Rome. And they would have done those type of things. They didn't do that specifically. They would have done those type of things with the destruction of Jerusalem as well in 70 AD. And there would be, I remember reading once that there were, they were under siege, and so there's always stories of cannibalism where cities are under siege. And I believe some of those stories attend the destruction of Jerusalem as well. Of course, death, the ripping open of pregnant mothers, the destruction of the city. I mean, just really bad things. And so he says that's coming, and it's coming against this city in which you stand now. But then he goes on to say this: if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. Now it's there that all of a sudden we stop and we go, wait a minute, are you talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or are you talking about the end of the world? If the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And such tribulation as it has not been seen from the beginning of the creation until now. I mean, aren't there other atrocities that perhaps, it's kind of a weird thing to compare atrocity and suffering. It's not the best thing to do. But since he introduces the comparative and says such as has not been seen since the beginning of creation until now, is he talking about Jerusalem anymore, or is he talking about something more? There's the undercurrent. Is he saying for Christians in every age, be on the lookout for suffering. Understand that suffering's part of the Christian way, but also understand and that it may increase for the church. And there may be a time still yet to come in which we will suffer more than Christians have suffered in the past. But the Lord in his mercy will cut short his days. Will cut short the days of that suffering, which is also a reminder that the coming of Christ is a good thing, that the coming of Christ does not create sufferings as much as the coming of Christ eliminates and shortens and limits the sufferings. That's sometimes a point of confusion people can have and don't always understand. People sometimes associate the coming of Christ with all the things that Revelation and passages like Mark 13 describe, the destruction of society and the coming of plagues and the rising of the Antichrist and all that. Well, the coming of Christ is not the primary cause of that. The coming of Christ is the deliverance from that. Those things are happening, yes, as a rebellion against the Christ who is coming. But his coming is a glorious good thing that saves and delivers, and that's why we live for it. And that's why he then goes on to caution in the very next verse, verses 21 and following, 21 through 23, be on the lookout for those who are false Christs, because people will know that you're looking for the Christ. Be on the lookout for false Christs and false prophets, because there are many who will try to lead you astray if it were possible. Because then he goes on to give us even more encouragement, not just that he's coming, but also the encouragement that no one really can lead astray the elect. Which is not to say we should trust ourselves, but it's precisely that the elect trust God and trust in the word of Christ. And that is why they cannot be led astray, because the word of Christ protects and delivers them from false prophets and false Christs. Now, have we had those in our days? Of course we have. I described one earlier in the study about the man who buried himself in the rubble of the temple and popped up and said, I am risen, I'm the Christ. But then also in our own day, we've had people who have prophesied the end of the world, who have collected a lot of cash on the basis of these prophecies, who have upended and uprooted lives. We have had cultic leaders who have brought children into danger and co-opted families and built whole communities based on doctrinal lies and a cult of personality. And so, yes, we still have this problem with us. And then at the time of the Reformation, Luther, just to give you another example from church history, Luther and his other reformers, and not just Luther and his other reformers, but people earlier in the Western church, people like the Franciscans, the members of the monastic order founded by St. Francis, they also, along with reformers and others throughout Christian history, used to complain that the Pope of their day was a false prophet or a false Christ. And the reason why they said that was because the Pope was promulgating rules that bound consciences that were not in Scripture, that Christ had not promulgated. And he did so as the vicar of Christ, as the one who's in the place of Christ. And so he's exalting himself within the church, and he's sort of fulfilling in that sense some of the prophecies of the Antichrist. And he's making distinctions among foods, and he's forbidding marriage, all the things that were told by St. Paul, or is it later in the epistles, that the Antichrist will do. And so there's, in every age, we have to be on the lookout for false doctrine, false teachers, and antichrists. And this is why doctrine matters. There's a really good, maybe I've mentioned it before here, but there was a really good sort of object lesson that was done by a youth leader once, in which he had all the kids in the kitchen at an overnighter at church, and said, we're going to make cookies, and you all sit, you all, so and so, you come help me make cookies, and the rest of you sit there while I talk to you. And as he was making the cookies, he said, okay, now we add the flour and the butter and the sugar, and they said, okay, now let's just add a cup of Drano. And the one kid went, what? He went, yeah, a cup of Drano. And he poured in the Drano and just continued to make the cookies. And he did it so quickly that the kids just kind of watched and didn't say anything. And then he proceeded to cook the cookies and bake them, and then came back later and said, okay, who wants a cookie? And of course, nobody did. And he said, well, why not? He said, there's flour, there's sugar, there's chocolate chip cookies, there's brown sugar, there's vanilla, there's butter, but there's egg, I think, in cookies. Yeah. So why don't you want these cookies? And they said, well, you put a little Drano in it. And he said, right. There can be all that goodness and just a little bit of bad, and the whole batch is ruined. It was actually a pretty good, some of those object lessons are kind of silly, but that always stuck with me anyway. When I heard about it, I didn't experience it firsthand, but when I heard about it, I thought, well, that's pretty good. His whole point was we can believe in the Holy Trinity, and Christ is raised from the dead, and Jesus forgives our sins, but if some false doctrine is introduced, it can ruin the whole batch. And that's why we're careful about the teaching of the church, and we're careful about teaching the faith so that people may know it and be on their guard against false prophets and antichrists who wish to steal from you the joy and the freedom of the gospel. But in those days, going back on to verse 24, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. And everyone goes, that can't be the destruction of Jerusalem, can it? That's got to be about the future. Yes, it is. But it is also about the destruction of Jerusalem in this sense. What Jesus is doing there is he's borrowing language from the prophets, like in Ezekiel, I believe also in Isaiah, where God says, when judgment comes against Jerusalem, this is what they will see. You will see the Son of Man on clouds, with his angels. And that was always an indication that God's coming against Jerusalem. So what Jesus is saying here is that time prophesied in the prophets, that God's judgment is coming against Jerusalem, is now also on its way. So in that sort of metaphorical or image sense is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. We, in our minds, we're so formed by sort of hyper-rationalism, modernistic thinking, shaped also by Latin and Roman thinking way back when, that sometimes this picture language with which the Hebrew spoke doesn't speak to us the same way. And we go, no, it can't be about Jerusalem. He doesn't talk about Jerusalem. We become so literal. but in the Hebrew way of speaking, which Jesus certainly comes from, borrowing that, bringing forth that imagery, just like he does with the abomination of desolation, calls forth associations that speak the message, allows the people who know these stories so well, because they would have known this so much better than we know it, that those associations speak to them the message, judgment's coming against Jerusalem, as well as the promise that at the end of history, Jesus will come with his angels and gather his elect and shorten the days of suffering. So it's really both things going on there in those verses. And then he goes on, and I need to wrap this up, but then he goes on and talks about the fig tree. I think we've said in earlier lessons and studies that fig trees are an emblem of Israel, not just the vine, not just milk and honey, but also the promise was to Moses and his followers, every man will have his own fig tree and his own vine. And so the fig tree becomes a sign of abundance. And what he is saying is that, and then it was interesting, is he uses an image of the fig tree as it's getting ready to bear fruit, to say, just as you can tell a tree is getting ready to bear fruit when it gets its leaves, so when you see these things happening is the fulfillment of all my words coming to bear, the harvest of his words. He's actually associating this suffering and destruction with a good thing, with the harvest of faith and the deliverance of the elect. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. There again, we'll say, well, is he talking? Does he mean that literally? It must not mean the end of the world, because he's talking about that generation. That generation has passed away. Again, currents, undercurrents. That generation was alive when Jerusalem is destroyed, but also undercurrent. The generation of which he's speaking is simply the children of God. We are all the children of God, no matter what the time and generation is by human accounting. Since the resurrection of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, the church is simply one generation, the generation of the children of God. And so the church will not pass away until all these things have come to take place as well. So there's both things happening here, the destruction of Jerusalem and a foreshadowing of the end of the world. What does that say to us? And this will be my final word, I guess, for the day. What does that say to us then as we, live in this faith today? Well, it means that we are living for a particular future. We are living with the recognition that there will be suffering. We're living with the recognition that things will get harder for Christians at certain times, not easier, that there may even be pain, but we're also living for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and in the great expectation that after the pain comes the peace, and that this is assured for us because he also rose from the dead after the great sufferings of the cross. Really, if we're talking about both Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the future end of the world, that also, if we can think of it as concentric circles, here is the destruction of Jerusalem, but it also means the destruction of the world. And at the center is the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus experiences in his person all the sufferings of the destruction of Jerusalem and all the sufferings of his church on the cross. And then in his resurrection, we have a picture of how that will play out for the church and for the creation when Jesus Christ comes again. There's one more thing I was going to say at the very end. I've been thinking about it all time and now I forgot. But anyway, that's the lesson for today. And so what it means is that, we want to be living in that hope and that expectation, and also with that reality, and not lose our minds when suffering comes. It comes. It is part of life. It's going to be part of life. And yes, it's horrible. We grieve and we can lament. We can be angry about it and pray that it go away. But it is part of life. And it's particularly part of the Christian life as the world's ancient enemy rages against us. But he's lost the day. He cannot win. His battle's already been won in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Peace be with you.